Mila Bennett had learned, over 3 years as executive assistant to Kang Tae-min, that the worst emails always arrived after 11. It was a rule of the universe as reliable as gravity, as predictable as the 6:12 train she took every morning from her tiny studio in a neighborhood that used to be affordable before the coffee shops arrived. Good news could wait until 9 a.m. Reasonable requests could wait until 9 a.m. Even most bad news had the decency to wait until 9. But anything that required Mila to reorganize her entire week, anything that made her stomach drop the way it dropped now, staring at the glow of her phone in the blue dark of her apartment, that always came at 11:47 p.m., time-stamped like a small, deliberate cruelty. Mila, need you in my office at 7 a.m. Not a request. T. She read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming on a second pass. They didn't. She set the phone face down on her chest and stared at the water stain on her ceiling that looked, depending on the day and her mood, like either a rabbit or a slow-moving threat. 3 years. 3 years of being the person who remembered that Tae-min took his coffee black before 9 and with oat milk after, who knew which board members needed to be flattered into agreement and which needed to be quietly outmaneuvered before a meeting even started, who had once stood in the rain outside a restaurant for 40 minutes holding an umbrella over a folder of contracts because he'd left them in the car and a client's fragile ego could not survive a 15-minute delay. 3 years of being indispensable in the particular, invisible way that meant nobody in that glass tower actually saw her at all. She thought about the day she'd started, fresh out of school, 23 years old and terrified, walking into the Kang Innovations lobby in a blazer she'd bought secondhand and pressed within an inch of its life. She'd been so grateful for the job she would have crawled across broken glass for it. She still, on her worst days, felt a little bit like she was crawling. She was good at her job. She was, if she allowed herself the small, dangerous vanity of admitting it in the privacy of her own skull, excellent at her job. She had once talked a furious investor down from pulling $11 million out of a Q3 round using nothing but patience and a very good memory for the man's daughter's name. She had rewritten Tae-min's public apology after a PR crisis so it didn't sound like it was written by a lawyer, and watched it get quoted approvingly in 3 major outlets, and never once heard her name attached to it. She had learned the hard way that competence without visibility was its own kind of quiet erasure, that you could be the reason a room ran smoothly and still be the last person anyone thought to introduce. She was so tired of being excellent in a way nobody clapped for. Mila closed her eyes. Somewhere in the building below, a pipe groaned in its familiar arthritic way. Her alarm was already set for 5:45. She'd need the extra 20 minutes to iron the blazer that made her look like she belonged in rooms she'd never actually been invited into. The navy one, not the black one, because the navy one photographed better in the fluorescent light of the 40th floor, a fact she'd learned from 3 years of quietly watching herself get cropped out of company photos. She didn't know yet that tomorrow would be the day everything changed. She only knew that Kang Tae-min did not summon her before dawn unless something in his carefully engineered world had gone sideways, and that wherever there was a mess, she would be the one asked to clean it. Quietly, efficiently, and without a single word of thanks. She fell asleep still turning the sentence over. Not a request. As if she'd ever, in 3 years, made him ask twice. She was almost right about the message being a mess to clean. She was entirely wrong about everything else. At 6:58 a.m., Mila stepped off the elevator on the 40th floor of the Kang Innovations Tower, his coffee in one hand, black, no oat milk, because whatever this was, she doubted it warranted after 9 formality, and her tablet tucked under her arm like a shield she'd carried into 100 battles she'd never gotten credit for winning. The floor was empty this early except for the night cleaning crew finishing their rounds and the low electric hum of machines that never fully slept. Tae-min's office had floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the whole waking city into something that looked designed rather than lived in, all glass and grid and early gold light spilling long shadows across the carpet. He was standing at the window when she came in, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, tie loosened in a way that suggested he'd either arrived very early or never quite gone home, looking like a man who had not slept and was too disciplined to let it show in any way except the faint, controlled tension along his jaw. "You're punctual," he said without turning. "I'm always punctual." She set the coffee on his desk, careful of the stack of untouched folders beside it. "You're rarely awake enough to notice, or gracious enough to say so." that earned her the smallest ghost of a smile. There and gone so fast she might have imagined it, before he turned to face her fully, and whatever softness had lived there for half a second vanished into the particular, practiced stillness he wore like armor into every meeting she'd ever watched him walk into. It was a look she'd catalogued over the years. The CEO face. Careful. Unreadable. Built, she suspected, out of necessity, by a boy who'd had to learn very young how to look composed while everything underneath was on fire. My grandmother's gala is in 9 days, he said. Mila already knew this, of course. It sat in his calendar color-coded in the deep burgundy she reserved specifically for Kong family events. The color of things that could not be moved, rescheduled, or delegated to anyone but her. The Kong Foundation's annual gala was the single most important social event on the family's calendar. The night the family's wealth and philanthropy and, more quietly, its succession politics, were all put on careful, glittering display for 300 of the most powerful people in the country. I know, she said carefully, already scanning ahead in her mind for what could possibly require a 7 a.m. summons about an event she'd had fully planned for 6 weeks. I've confirmed the venue, the caterer, and your suit fitting is Thursday at 4. If something's changed with the vendor, that's not the problem. He exhaled through his nose. A small habit she'd long ago learned was the prelude to something he did not want to say out loud. He turned back toward the window briefly, as if the city might offer him better phrasing than he could find on his own. The problem is my grandmother has decided that this year, attendance requires a +1. Specifically, she has informed the entire extended family that she expects, this year, finally, to meet the woman I've apparently been. He paused, choosing the next word like it cost him something physical to hand over. Serious about? Mila blinked. Are you seeing someone? No. Then I genuinely don't understand the crisis. She's been talking to my cousins. He said it the way other men might describe a hostile takeover. My cousins have been talking to 2 members of the board. The board has started asking careful, deniable questions about succession stability that have nothing to do with quarterly earnings and everything to do with whether I'm a serious, settled, marriageable adult capable of steering this company for the next 30 years, or whether I'm still just the boy who buried both his parents inside the same year and never fully came back from it. His voice stayed flat, controlled, but something underneath it cracked, briefly, like ice giving way in one small place. I've never said that sentence out loud to anyone in this building before, by the way. Mila filed that away somewhere careful, somewhere she would not examine too closely while he was still watching her. So what do you need from me? She asked, though some small, treacherous part of her already suspected the shape of the answer, and was already quietly bracing for it the way you brace before a fall you can see coming and can't quite stop. Taemin looked at her for a long moment. Longer than any look he'd given her in 3 years of early mornings and late nights and every crisis in between. It wasn't the look he gave board members or reporters, or the string of impeccably dressed women who occasionally appeared on his arm at charity dinners and disappeared just as quietly a few weeks later, unremarked upon, unmourned. It was something more assessing, more careful, more like he was trying to decide whether he was about to ask her for something reasonable, or something that would cost him a friendship he hadn't realized, until this exact moment, that he badly wanted to keep. I need you to be my fiancé for 1 night, he said, in front of my family, convincingly. The coffee cup she'd just set down suddenly seemed like the only stable object in the entire room. I'm your assistant. You're the only person I trust not to sell the story to a tabloid, not to embarrass me in front of the board, and not to fall apart under the specific, brutal scrutiny my grandmother is capable of, he said, the words coming faster now, like he'd rehearsed them in the mirror sometime after midnight and needed to get through them before his nerve failed. You've handled hostile investors, a Category 3 PR crisis, and my aunt's seating chart demands without so much as blinking. I don't need an actress, Mila. I need someone competent enough to survive 1 evening pretending to love me. Pretending. The word landed strangely. A small stone dropped into water she hadn't realized, until that exact second, was that still. That's insane, she said, and laughed once, disbelieving, though the laugh came out thinner than she intended. Taemin, that's actually insane. Your grandmother has known me for 3 years as your assistant. She's going to take 1 look at us in that dress and know. My grandmother, he said. Has met you exactly twice. Both times for under 5 minutes. Both times while you were holding a clipboard and I was actively trying to get her off the phone with somebody else. She does not know you, Mila. She knows of you the way people know of very good furniture. Reliably there, quietly essential, never actually looked at. You should have stung. It did sting, a little, the raw accuracy of it landing somewhere old and familiar. 3 years of being furniture in rooms where every important decision got made without her name ever entering the conversation. But underneath the sting, something else stirred too. Something dangerously close to an opening. And if I say no? Then I go alone. My grandmother assumes the whispers about my instability have merit. The board grows nervous in the specific way boards grow nervous. And somewhere in the next 18 months a very expensive, very public campaign quietly begins to convince shareholders I need a co-CEO to stabilize the company. His voice stayed level, but his hands, she noticed, did not. They pressed flat against the edge of his desk like he needed the solid surface to keep himself upright. I'm not asking you as your employer, Mila. I'm asking you as... He stopped, recalibrated visibly the way she'd watched him do in 100 negotiations. I'm asking you because I genuinely do not know who else in my life I could ask this of. And there it was. Not an order, however it had started. A request, offered clumsily, from a man who plainly did not know how to make one. Mila looked at him, really looked, past the tailored shirt and the tired eyes and 3 years of scrupulously maintained professional distance, and thought about every 11:47 p.m. email, every unspoken thank you, every time she'd stood in a doorway holding his coat while somebody else got introduced to somebody important. She thought about the water stain on her ceiling, and her mother's medication, paid for on time every month because of this exact job, and the particular ache of being needed constantly and wanted never. She thought, this is either the worst idea I've ever agreed to, or the first time in 3 years anyone in this building has needed me to be more than merely useful. I'll need a raise, she said finally, because if she was going to leap, she was at least going to negotiate the terms of the fall. A real one, and a real vacation after 2 weeks. Not the fake kind where you call me 9 times about the Henderson account. Something in his shoulders loosened, fractionally, like a held breath finally let go. Done. And you have to actually tell me things. Family history. Inside jokes. Which fork is which at that estate, because I looked it up once online and there were 4 of them and I panicked. What your grandmother's favorite flower is. I'm not walking into a war zone unarmed. Taemin. Done. A pause, longer this time, and something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to its cousin. Thank you, Mila. 2 words. 2 small, ordinary words that landed in her chest like something rare. Not the clipped, transactional gratitude of a boss dismissing a task competently completed. The kind she'd received 1,000 times and learned to stop expecting to feel. This sounded almost like relief. Almost like he meant it with his whole chest. The way you thank someone who has just quietly, unexpectedly, saved you from something you were too proud to say you were afraid of. She nodded once, reaching for the professional distance like a life raft, already opening a new folder on her tablet. Gala, plan. But underneath the practiced calm, something in her had shifted in a way she suspected would not shift back, and she did not yet have a name for the feeling, only its weight, warm and unfamiliar, settling somewhere behind her ribs. 9 days, she thought. 9 days to become someone worth watching. She had no idea yet how much of that feeling had nothing to do with the gala at all. They wrote the rules that same afternoon, in the small conference room on the 40th floor that smelled permanently of dry erase marker and burnt coffee, door locked. Taemin's usual assistant of assistants informed that they were reviewing gala logistics, which was, Mila supposed, technically not a lie. Rule 1, Taemin said, standing at the whiteboard with the particular seriousness he usually reserved for merger negotiations. Marker uncapped like a weapon. We need an origin story. Something believable. Something my grandmother won't be able to poke a single hole in, because she will try, and she is very good at finding the seams in things. We met at work, Mila said, settling into a chair with her tablet balanced on her knee. That part's not even a lie, which is a good foundation to build on. Right? But my assistant, quietly transforming into my fiancée, over the span of 8 months needs a turning point. A moment where something changed. Investors love an origin story. Grandmothers love them more. Mila thought about it, chewing the cap of her pen, running through 3 years of memory for something usable, something with enough texture to survive interrogation. The Chicago trip, she said finally. 8 months ago. The flight got canceled, the whole terminal turned into chaos, remember that storm system, and we were stuck at O'Hare for 6 hours. We ended up eating at that terrible airport Italian place because it was the only thing still open past 10. That's when it started. Slow burn. It's realistic because it's true mostly, minus the part where anything actually happened. Slow burn, Taemin repeated, testing the phrase for structural integrity the way he tested a contract clause. Fine. That tracks. What else do we need? Your grandmother's favorite flower. You mentioned there'd be a test. Peonies. She grows them herself at the family estate in Yangpyeong. There's a whole garden. It's practically a second job for her. Pale pink, specifically, never white. She thinks white peonies are for funerals, and has said so at 3 separate weddings, to increasingly diminishing social returns. He said it automatically, in the flat cadence of something memorized in childhood and never questioned since. She'll ask if I know your favorite flower too. She always does that. It's not idle conversation. It's a test, and she's been giving it to every woman I've ever brought within 50 feet of her since I was 19. Mila wrote peonies, pink not white on her tablet, and then, beneath it, without quite deciding to, my favorite flower, need to pick something believable, has to sound spontaneous, not rehearsed. Tell me about your parents, she said, more gently than she'd planned to, watching something tighten behind his eyes before he answered. The same flicker she'd caught that morning and hadn't been able to name. My father ran the company before me. Car accident, 6 years ago, on the coastal highway, in weather that should have kept everyone off the road. His voice slid into the flat, rehearsed cadence he used for earnings reports, a register built specifically for surviving hard sentences without actually feeling them in front of an audience. My mother died 11 months later. The doctors called it a heart condition. My grandmother calls it grief, and I think, honestly, they're both right, and I think that's the cruelest possible diagnosis a person can receive, because it means love itself can be the thing that eventually kills you. He glanced at her, something raw flickering behind the careful stillness. My grandmother raised the rest of me. She's the reason I'm CEO instead of one of my cousins nobody quite trusts with real authority. She's also the exact reason I know how much scrutiny is coming for you on Saturday, and I need you to understand that before you agree to any of this. I can handle scrutiny, Mila said, quieter now. I survived your aunt at the shareholder dinner. I survived the seating chart incident, which, for the record, nearly ended in actual bloodshed. I will survive one grandmother. She's not like my aunt. For the first time all afternoon, real worry crossed his face, unguarded in a way she wasn't used to seeing. My aunt wants gossip, something to repeat over brunch. My grandmother wants the truth, and she has an unnerving talent for getting it out of people who came prepared to lie to her. She'll ask questions that sound casual and aren't. She'll watch how I look at you when I think no one's paying attention. She built this entire company's reputation on reading rooms better than anyone alive. Mila, if we're going to survive Saturday, we can't just perform this. We have to. He hesitated, marker still frozen midair. Have to what? We have to actually know each other, he said. Not the org chart version. Not the version where you know my coffee order and I know your start date. The real one. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the whiteboard between them, or the marker still capped uselessly in his hand. Okay, Mila said slowly, setting her tablet aside entirely, giving him her full attention in a way she rarely allowed herself during work hours. Then tell me something true. Something that's not on your company bio page. Not in any press packet. Taemin was quiet long enough that she genuinely thought he might refuse, might retreat back behind the CEO face and change the subject to seating arrangements. Then, quietly, I hate the gala. Every single year. I've hated it since I was 12 years old, standing next to my father in a suit that itched at the collar, shaking 300 hands and pretending to understand what any of it actually meant. I still don't fully understand what most of it means, if I'm honest. I've just gotten very efficient at surviving it. He looked at her, something unguarded surfacing behind his eyes for just a moment before he could stop it. That's not in any bio. I've never told anyone that, actually. Not even my grandmother. Mila felt something in her chest go soft and dangerous. An ache she recognized but didn't yet trust herself to name. Thank you for telling me. Your turn. She hadn't expected the reciprocity to come so fast, and it caught her off guard enough that the truth slipped out before she could reach for something safer to offer instead. I took this job because my mom got sick the same month I graduated, she said, and I needed something that paid enough to cover both her medical bills and our rent, and I was too scared to ever ask for anything better than what I already had, because I was terrified of losing even this. I used to lie awake doing math in my head, how many months of savings we had left, what would happen if I lost the job, what would happen if she got worse. I never told you any of that. I don't tell anyone that. Honestly, I don't know why I just... She stopped, aware suddenly of how exposed she'd let herself become. The way you feel after handing someone something fragile without quite meaning to. Because I asked for something real, Taemin said quietly, and you gave it to me instead of something rehearsed and safe. That's rarer than you'd think, in my particular corner of the world. Most people give me the version they think I want. Is she okay now? He added, after a beat, and the question landed with an unfamiliar softness. Not the efficient concern of a boss checking on an employee's productivity, but something that sounded like it actually mattered to him. She's better, Mila said, throat suddenly tight. Much better. It's been 2 years. I'm glad, he said simply, and the plainness of it, the total absence of performance, undid something in her more than any elaborate sympathy could have. Their eyes held 1 second longer than was strictly professional, the silence between them thick with something neither of them had a category for yet. Mila cleared her throat first, reaching back for the tablet like a life raft. Right? Okay. Rule 2, physical stuff. We need to be able to touch each other without looking like we're both being mildly electrocuted, or your grandmother will spot the fraud from across the ballroom. Taemin actually laughed at that. Short, surprised, entirely real, nothing rehearsed about it at all. Noted. I mean it. Hand-holding, minimum requirement. Possibly a slow dance, if your grandmother's the type to watch the dance floor closely. She's exactly the type. She once told my cousin's fiancé she danced like she was afraid of the man holding her, and the engagement was called off 4 months later. I'm not saying there's a direct correlation. I'm saying my grandmother would want you to know there might be. Then we practice, Mila said, standing, setting the tablet down with sudden decisiveness. Practice, he repeated, like the word itself required a full structural review before he could commit to it. Unless you'd rather explain to 300 guests, live, in real time, why your fiancée dances like she's defusing an explosive device. That earned her another laugh, and this one settled something loose and warm behind her ribs that she was absolutely going to have to examine later. Privately, alone, far away from a CEO who was currently watching her with an expression she still didn't have a name for. Fine, he said, setting the marker down at last. Practice. He held out his hand. Not dramatically, not like a scene lifted from a film, just simply the way you'd offer a hand to help someone up off the floor. Mila looked at it for 1 heartbeat too long before she took it. His hand was warm, steadier than she expected, for a man who'd looked, that very morning, like his whole carefully engineered world was quietly coming apart at the seams. There's no music, she pointed out. There's the ambient hum of the conference room HVAC system, he said, entirely gravely. Very romantic. My grandmother would be thrilled with the ambience. And Mila Bennett. 3 years invisible, 3 years excellent and unthanked. 3 years certain that being needed and being wanted were 2 entirely different countries that would never share a border in her life. Laughed so hard and so suddenly that she had to let go of his hand to cover her mouth, and Taemin watched her do it with an expression that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like a man discovering something he hadn't expected to like quite this much. Neither of them mentioned it. But neither of them looked away first, either, and the conference room, small and marker-scented and entirely unremarkable, held the beginning of something neither of them was ready yet to call by its real name. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned for but both, quietly, began to look forward to. Every evening after the office emptied out, they stayed late. Not for the usual reasons, not for earnings calls or crisis management, but for what Taemin had started calling, with visible discomfort at the phrase, homework. He would perch on the edge of his desk with a legal pad, and Mila would sit across from him with her knees tucked up in the visitor chair, and he would tell her things. He told her his grandmother's actual birthday, not the one listed in the press materials, which was off by 11 days for reasons no one in the family could fully explain anymore. He told her about his cousin Yuna, who had a sharp tongue and a soft heart and would almost certainly try to catch Mila in an inconsistency purely for sport, not malice. He told her about his uncle Sang-hoon, who ran the shipping division and had wanted Taemin's job badly enough, 6 years ago, that the grief of losing his brother had briefly curdled into something uglier before he'd managed to talk himself back from it. "He's not a threat anymore," Taemin said of his uncle. "But he'll be watching you carefully all night, looking for a reason to say I'm not thinking clearly. Don't let him rattle you." "I've dealt with worse than a disgruntled uncle," Mila said. "I once got yelled at by a hedge fund manager for 45 minutes because his flowers arrived pink instead of white. That was my aunt's wedding. I'm aware. I still have a mild flower-related trauma response." He laughed at that. He laughed more, she was noticing, in these late office hours than she'd heard from him in the entire 3 years prior combined, and each time it happened it landed somewhere new in her chest, warm and slightly alarming. On the 4th night of homework, disaster nearly struck in miniature. Priya from marketing knocked on the open door with a stack of proofs that needed sign-off, caught the two of them sitting close together over a legal pad covered in family names and flower preferences, and raised an eyebrow with the particular delight of someone who has just stumbled onto office gossip several days before anyone else. "Am I interrupting something?" Priya asked, in a tone that made clear she hoped the answer was yes. "Gala logistics," Taemin said smoothly, sliding the legal pad half under a folder with a practiced ease that made Mila suspect he'd had more practice at concealment than she'd realized. "Seating charts." "Aha," Priya said, clearly unconvinced, gaze flicking between them with open curiosity. "Well, the proofs need your initials by end of day, whenever you're done with your very intense seating chart conversation." She left. Mila exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was close," she said. "She won't say anything," Taemin said, though his ears had gone faintly pink in a way Mila found she rather liked noticing. Probably is not the standard of certainty I was hoping for, given the stakes." "Welcome to my life," he said, and there was something rueful and warm in it that made Mila think, not for the first time that week, that the man across from her was very different from the CEO the building thought it knew, and that she was quietly being handed a version of him almost nobody else ever got to see. 2 days before the gala, Taemin's driver dropped Mila outside a boutique on the 10th floor of a building she'd only ever seen from the sidewalk, the kind of place with no visible price tags anywhere, where a woman in a cream suit appeared the moment the elevator doors opened and said, "Miss Bennett, we've been expecting you," in a tone that suggested Mila was someone who got expected in places like this all the time. "There's been a mistake," Mila said immediately, old reflexes kicking in. "I think this appointment is for someone else." "Mr. Kang's account," the woman confirmed smoothly, already gesturing her toward a private fitting room with pale gold walls and a 3-way mirror. "He called ahead personally," he said, and I'm quoting him directly, "Get her something that makes her feel like the room is lucky to have her in it." Mila stood very still, the words landing somewhere unexpected and tender. She thought about every off-the-rack blazer she'd ironed at midnight to look presentable for board meetings where she'd stand silently against the wall holding a clipboard while other people got introduced as important. She thought about 3 years of being competent and invisible in equal, exhausting measure. And now here was a total stranger repeating a sentence Taemin had apparently said out loud to another human being, specifically about her. Made the room lucky to have her in it. "Okay," Mila said, voice a little unsteady. "Show me everything you've got." She tried on 6 dresses before she found the one. Deep emerald green, off the shoulder, the kind of cut that didn't scream for attention so much as simply assumed it would receive it anyway, without needing to ask. When she stepped out from behind the curtain and caught her own reflection in the 3-way mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because the dress had transformed her into someone unrecognizable, but because it had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let her look like exactly who she already was, finally unhidden, finally allowed to take up the space she'd spent 3 years quietly shrinking to fit inside. Her phone buzzed. A text from Taemin. "How's it going?" She sent back a photo. Not of herself, still too cautious for that, just the dress on its hanger against the gold wall, hedging her bets against disappointment. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. A small anxious rhythm that made her smile despite herself. "That's the one," he finally wrote. "Trust me. You haven't even seen it on." She typed back. "I don't need to. I know you'll make it look like it was made for you. Get it? Please." Mila stared at the message for longer than was strictly reasonable, feeling something warm and unfamiliar spread slowly through her chest. Not quite pride, not quite something else, something that sat right at the border between the two and stubbornly refused to be named just yet, the way you refuse to name a thing you're not sure you're allowed to keep. "We'll take this one," she told the woman in the cream suit and tried, without much success, to ignore the small, treacherous voice in her head that whispered, "He's never talked to you like this before. Not once in 3 whole years. Not until this started being pretend." The alterations took 40 minutes. Mila spent them sitting in the boutique's small waiting lounge, scrolling through old photos of the two of them from work events, professional, cropped, carefully neutral, and noticing for the first time the way he was almost always looking slightly toward her in the background of every single one, even when the photo's actual subject was someone else entirely. The night before the gala, Taemin called her. Not texted, called, which was unusual enough that Mila answered with her heart already climbing halfway up her throat before she'd even said hello. "Is something wrong?" she asked immediately, old habits surfacing before anything else could. "No, everything's fine." A pause, and she could hear, faintly, the sound of him moving through his apartment, a door closing somewhere behind him, the particular quiet of a man alone in a very large space. "I wanted to go over the timeline one more time. And I wanted to—" He stopped, started again, and this time his voice had lost some of its usual careful polish. "I wanted to make sure you're okay. About tomorrow. I've been so focused on logistics all week that I don't think I've actually stopped to ask if you're okay with any of this." Something in Mila's chest cracked open, small and quiet and entirely unprofessional. "I'm nervous," she admitted, curling deeper into the corner of her second-hand couch. "Not about the lying part exactly. About being looked at, I think. I'm used to being the person nobody notices in a room. Tomorrow, everyone's going to be looking directly at me, and I don't know what to do with that." "They're going to be looking at both of us," Taemin said. "And Mila, for what it's worth, I've never minded people looking at you. I think I've just gotten very good, over the years, at not letting that show because you worked for me, and that felt like a line I wasn't allowed to cross, ever, no matter what." His voice dropped, quieter, more unguarded than she'd ever once heard it in 3 years of early mornings. "I'm not sure I've been fair to you, honestly. 3 years of you being extraordinary, and I don't think I've said that out loud, clearly, even a single time." Mila sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. Phone pressed hard against her ear like she could hold the entire moment in place by sheer force of will. "You don't have to say it now just because we're doing this. Because of the gala." "I'm not saying it because of the gala," he said, and something in his tone made it impossible to doubt him. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I should have said it a long time ago, long before any of this started, and tomorrow isn't really the reason at all. It's just the excuse I finally needed to say it out loud." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt, instead, like the pause right before something important begins, the held breath just before the first note of a song neither of them had heard yet but both, somehow, already recognized. "Get some sleep, Mila," Taemin said finally, softer than she'd ever heard him, softer than the boardroom voice, softer even than the homework session voice. "Tomorrow, I need you to walk in there like you already know you belong. Because you do. You always have. I've just been the last person in the building slow enough to say it clearly." He hung up before she could find her voice to answer, which was probably, she thought later, staring at the ceiling and its familiar rabbit-shaped stain, exactly for the best, because she wasn't at all sure her voice would have worked. The Kong family estate in Yangpyeong looked, in the last gold light of early evening, like something lifted whole out of a film. Sprawling grounds strung with hundreds of small lanterns, a marble terrace overlooking gardens heavy with the scent of late summer jasmine, and at its center, a grandmother who Mila would come to understand, within the first 90 seconds of meeting her, was every bit as formidable as advertised. Kong Soonja was small, barely reaching Mila's shoulder, silver hair swept into an elegant knot, eyes that missed absolutely nothing in the room. She took Mila's hand in both of hers, cool and dry and remarkably steady, and studied her for a long, unhurried moment before speaking a single word. "So," she said finally, in English precise enough to suggest she'd practiced it specifically for this evening. "You are the one who finally makes my grandson smile like he means it." Mila felt Taemin's hand find the small of her back, warm and grounding, an anchor she hadn't realized she needed until it was there. "Grandmother, this is Mila. I know exactly who she is," Soonja said, without taking her eyes off Mila for even a second. "I have known who she is for 3 years. I have simply been waiting for him to notice." Mila's stomach dropped straight through the marble floor. "Grandmother," Taemin started, a warning edge creeping fast into his voice. "Oh, relax," Soonja said, patting his arm with the brisk affection of a woman who had been correcting him since he was small enough to need correcting for entirely different reasons. "I am not going to embarrass you in front of 300 guests, though I could, and you both know it. I am simply telling this girl that I noticed the way you talked about your assistant long before you ever called her your fiancée. The Chicago trip, was it? 8 months ago? You called me the very next week and told me about some terrible airport dinner, and I thought to myself, finally, something has cracked him open." Mila's mind raced, cover story and reality colliding in a way she hadn't braced for. The Chicago trip, their carefully constructed, thoroughly rehearsed cover story, was somehow impossibly already half-true, already living in Soonja's memory as something real. She glanced sideways at Taemin, whose ears had gone faintly, unmistakably red. "I may have mentioned it," he admitted, jaw tight. "I didn't realize You never realize anything about yourself," Soonja said, fond and merciless in equal measure. "It's precisely why you needed someone paying attention on your behalf." She turned back to Mila, and her expression softened, just slightly, into something warmer, something almost tender. "Whatever this is between you two, however it truly began, I would like you to know that I am glad of it. My grandson has spent 6 years building walls so high I had genuinely stopped believing anyone would ever climb over them. You seem to have managed it without appearing to try very hard at all, which I find far more convincing than if you had tried too hard." Mila didn't trust herself to speak, so she simply nodded, throat tight, and let Soonja's sharp, assessing eyes finally move on to easier targets among the arriving guests. "Now," Soonja said, already turning toward the ballroom with the brisk efficiency of a woman with 300 more introductions still ahead of her. "Come, let the vultures see you both. Let them understand this family is not falling apart, whatever they have been whispering at their little dinner parties. It is, in fact, finally coming together." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of introductions, careful smiles, and the particular exhaustion of performing ease for an audience that was, Mila slowly began to realize, not nearly as hostile as she'd braced for. Taemin's cousin Yuna turned out to be sharp-tongued exactly as promised, but curious rather than cruel, peppering Mila with rapid-fire questions about the Chicago trip that Mila answered smoothly, homework paying off in real time, until Yuna finally grinned and said, "Okay, I believe you," which is annoying, because I was hoping to catch you in something. His uncle Sang-hoon was harder, a tall, contained man with Taemin's same watchful stillness, who shook Mila's hand a beat too long and asked pointed questions about how, exactly, she'd come to know the family's history so thoroughly for someone who'd apparently only been dating his nephew for 8 months. "I make it my business to know things," Mila said, holding his gaze steady, channeling 3 years of hostile investor management into a single sentence. "It's rather my whole personality, if you ask anyone in the building." Sang-hoon's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost respect. "I can see why he keeps you close," he said, and moved on. And Taemin's hand tightened briefly at her waist in a silent, grateful thank you. It was during the third slow song of the evening, on the crowded dance floor beneath strings of warm lantern light, that the performance quietly, entirely, stopped feeling like one at all. "You're good at this?" Mila murmured, one hand resting at his shoulder, the other held loose and warm in his. "The dancing. You undersold yourself badly. Back in that conference room. I had a very patient teacher," he said. "Extremely stern about proper hand placement, as I recall." "I was not stern. You threatened to let me embarrass myself in front of 300 people if I didn't take the lessons seriously. That's just good coaching, and you know it." He laughed, low and entirely real, and pulled her fractionally closer. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the fine fabric of his jacket. Close enough that the lanterns and the music and the low murmuring hum of 300 separate conversations all seemed to blur, gently, into something distant and unimportant, background noise to whatever was actually happening between them right now. "Mila?" he said, quieter now, some of the polish finally gone entirely from his voice, replaced by something rawer, more unguarded than she had ever once heard from him. "Can I tell you something true? Off the record. Not for my grandmother. Not for the board. Not for the cameras posted outside the gate. Just for you. Always," she said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it more completely than she'd expected to. "I don't think I'm pretending anymore," he said. "I honestly don't know when exactly that stopped being true. Maybe it was never entirely true to begin with, if I'm honest with myself, which I am trying very hard to be tonight. But standing here right now, with you, I'm not performing a single thing. I just don't want to let go of you when this song ends, and I'd very much like your permission not to." Mila's breath caught somewhere high in her chest and simply refused to move. "Taemin, you don't have to say anything back," he said quickly, some of his old careful distance creeping back in at the edges, like he was already bracing himself for a gentle rejection. "I just needed you to know it, whatever happens after tonight. Whether you go back to being my assistant tomorrow morning and we quietly agree to never mention any of this again. I needed you to know it stopped being pretend for me somewhere around the second day of homework, when you told me you'd been terrified of losing even this job, and I realized, with something close to actual panic, that I was far more terrified of losing you." Mila reached up, slowly, and rested her palm against the side of his face. The first entirely unscripted, unrehearsed thing she'd done all evening, all week, maybe in 3 whole years. "I don't want to go back to pretending either," she said, voice unsteady but certain. "I'm honestly not sure I ever really was. Not fully. Not since that first morning in your office." The song ended around them, unnoticed by either. What they noticed instead was the small, deliberate space between their faces slowly, certainly closing, not fast, not desperate, but slow and sure, the way you approach something you have wanted for a very long time and are, finally, allowed to have. When Taemin kissed her, right there in the middle of the dance floor, in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the country and one small, silver-haired grandmother watching from the edge of the room with an expression of profound, entirely vindicated satisfaction, Mila Bennett, 3 years invisible, 3 years excellent and unthanked. Finally felt entirely, unmistakably seen. Somewhere near the bar, Yuna elbowed her mother and whispered, loudly enough to carry, "Told you it wasn't fake?" And Sunja, watching her grandson kiss a woman like he'd been waiting his whole guarded life to be allowed to, simply smiled into her champagne and said nothing at all, because for once, she didn't need to. It nearly fell apart an hour later, in the quiet hallway outside the coat check, and the person who nearly broke it was Sang-hoon. "A word," he said to Taemin, low enough that it wasn't quite a request, and Mila, catching the shift in the air, stayed close instead of stepping away. "Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of Mila," Taemin said, and something in the flat certainty of it made Mila's chest tighten with an entirely different kind of feeling than the one she'd been swimming in all night. "Fine." Sang-hoon's eyes moved to Mila, assessing, not unkind but not warm either. "I looked into the Chicago trip 8 months ago. I checked the flight logs out of professional habit. I do that when the succession of a multi-billion-dollar company suddenly hinges on a relationship nobody in this family had heard about 3 weeks ago." Pause, deliberate. "Your flight wasn't canceled that night." Mine was on a different route, same storm system. Yours landed on time. The hallway went very still. Mila felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her heels, the careful architecture of the last 9 days threatening to come down around her in one bad hallway conversation. "You're right," she said, before Taemin could speak, before the silence could stretch long enough to look like guilt. It wasn't the flight that was delayed. It was the connecting one out of Chicago after we landed, a small regional carrier, not the kind of thing that makes it into major flight tracking databases. 6 hours on the ground, watching gate agents try to solve a mechanical issue that never got solved. I'm not surprised you didn't find it. It's not the kind of detail anyone thinks to check unless they're standing in the actual terminal, cursing at a departure board. She held Sang-hoon's gaze, steady, 3 years of hostel room management humming underneath every word. "I was there. I remember exactly which restaurant we ended up eating at, and exactly how bad the tiramisu was, if you'd like the name of it for your records." It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been a regional connector delayed that week. She'd checked, quietly, days ago, precisely because she'd suspected someone in this family might eventually go looking. She'd built the story with a lawyer's precision, and it held. Sang-hoon studied her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting from suspicion toward something closer to reluctant respect. "Thorough," he said finally. "I told you," Mila said. "It's my whole personality." He almost smiled, nodded once, and walked back toward the ballroom without another word, and Taemin let out a breath he'd clearly been holding since the first sentence, reaching for her hand in the empty hallway with a grip that said more than any speech could have. "You just saved this entire evening," he said quietly. "I told you I could handle scrutiny," Mila said, though her own heart was still hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "I know. I just didn't expect to fall even further in love with you in the middle of doing it." Mila stared at him. "You've fallen in love with me?" "Somewhere around the 4th night of homework, I think," Taemin said, quiet and entirely serious now, all performance gone from his voice. "You sat across from me with your knees tucked up in that ugly visitor chair and told me about your mother's medical bills like it cost you something to say it out loud, and I remember thinking very clearly that I had spent 3 years working 12 feet away from the most remarkable person I'd ever met and somehow never noticed." "That chair isn't ugly," Mila said, because her heart was too full for anything more coherent, and Taemin laughed, soft and real, and pulled her back toward the ballroom with their fingers still laced together, no longer performing anything at all. They didn't discuss it that night, not properly, not with the careful, itemized logic they'd used to build every other part of this arrangement. They simply drove back to the city together in the back of his car, her hand loosely laced in his, the emerald dress pulled soft around her knees, both of them quiet in the particular, easy way of two people who have just crossed a line they can't uncross and don't want to. It was 3 days later, back in the ordinary fluorescent light of the 40th floor office, that Taemin finally said the thing neither of them had said aloud since the gala. "I don't want you to be my assistant anymore," he said, standing in the doorway of her small workspace, hands in his pockets, looking more nervous than she'd ever once seen him look walking into a boardroom full of hostile shareholders. Mila's stomach dropped. "Are you firing me?" "No. God, no." He almost laughed, catching himself before it could tip into something anxious. "I mean, I don't want the only reason you're in my life to be a job title. I don't want to spend every single day being your boss and pretending that's the whole shape of what's actually between us now. I want—" He exhaled, visibly steadying himself, the way she'd watched him do before every hard sentence for 3 straight years, except this time the sentence had nothing to do with the company at all. "I want to hire someone else to manage my calendar. And I want to take you to dinner tonight as the man who's in love with you. Not the fiancé clause. Not for the board, not for my grandmother. Just that. Just us. Finally, with nothing pretend left in it." Mila set down her tablet very carefully, because her hands had started shaking and she didn't fully trust herself not to drop it. "You realize," she said, voice unsteady with something that was equal parts disbelief and joy, "that I'm going to need a very generous severance package for this. Whatever you want. And you have to actually thank people out loud from now on. Not just me. Everyone. It's a genuine character flaw, and I'm only agreeing to fix it if you commit to therapy about it. Duly noted, he said, crossing the small room in 3 steps and taking both her hands in his, thumbs brushing gently over her knuckles. Dinner tonight? Tonight, Mila agreed and felt, for the first time in 3 long invisible years, entirely, completely, unmistakably chosen. Not for what she could quietly manage or discreetly fix or flawlessly execute, but simply, finally, for herself. The Kong Foundation Gala came around again, as it always did, burgundy on the calendar, the same marble terrace, the same jasmine-heavy gardens. This time, Mila arrived not as a fiancée playing a part, but as one for real, a ring on her hand that Taemin had given her on a Tuesday, of all unremarkable days, in the small conference room where the whiteboard still, occasionally, bore the faint ghost of peonies, pink not white beneath whatever quarters projections had been written over it since. Soonja found her near the terrace doors, exactly as she had a year before, and took both her hands in that same cool, steady grip. "You still look like the room is lucky to have you in it," the older woman said, eyes bright. "I had a good teacher," Mila said, glancing across the ballroom to where Taemin stood laughing at something Yuna had said, looking, for once, entirely unguarded in a room full of people. "No," Soonja said, following her gaze with a small, satisfied smile. "I think, my dear, you simply finally let someone see what was there all along." Somewhere across the room, Taemin caught Mila's eye and started walking toward her, and Mila, 3 years invisible no longer, 3 years excellent and finally, thoroughly, permanently thanked, walked forward to meet him halfway. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, leave us a comment. Also like, share and subscribe to our channel, and click on the notification bell to get notified whenever a new story is made.